you can count when you're happy. 1, 2, 3, 4, you can count when you're sad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or count when you're frightened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, count when you're mad. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Counting is wonderful. Counting is marvelous. Counting's terrific, and how?
This week on Smallville, it's the thrilling, suspense-packed, nail-biting, one-part special television event, Who Shot Lionel Luthor? Spoiler alert, it wasn't Maggie Simpson. So somebody finally lost it and decided to do something about all the pain and anguish Lionel has caused to the people in this leafy little hamlet and shoots him in Lex's office. I thought Lionel made it pretty clear he was packing up his things and moving out last episode, but then I guess it would be harder to have this murder attempt take place in this town. But there's a lot of that in this episode. We also have Lionel revealing that Martha will no longer be working for him right after a big setup at the end of Insurgents about Jonathan and Martha conspiring to spy on Lionel through her job. Turns out that Jonathan made the age-old mistake of throwing an empty threat at Lionel after finding out about the watch he gave Martha last episode, the day Lionel gets shot. Oops. But if a guy horning in on my wife called his multi-$1,000 watch the equivalent of a Whitman sampler, for me, I'd have a hard time keeping my composure too. This is the ultimate white-collar burn to a guy whose wife you're moving in on. Jonathan's paying for his temper this episode, but he's sure come a long way from hitting Martha's dad when he didn't approve of their getting married. Remember, he was a rich, arrogant jerkface too. Jonathan back then might just have lost it like Sheriff Ethan does here and come back with a gun. Oh, spoiler alert, the almost murderer is Sheriff Ethan. To quote Weird Al from The Night Santa Went Crazy, something finally must have snapped in his brain. And if Lionel had actually died, I imagine Lex would be on the phone every night negotiating the movie rights. Ethan's investigated one too many Kryptofreak murders, I think, and now he's starting to think like a hormonal, hysterical, homicidal high school kid. The episode puts 3 potential attempted murderers up front as red herrings, so we won't guess it's Ethan, which kind of plays as the equivalent to the butler did it. And those suspects are Jonathan, who might have shot Lionel out of jealousy, Lex, who might have shot his dad because he's buying out LexCorp out from under him via underhanded tactics to force Lex's board to sell him their shares, and Lionel's corporate stooge, Dominic, who's furious at Lionel for letting Lex back in the fold when he thought Lionel was grooming him, as Lex puts it, as his successor. Really odd that we haven't seen this guy since Reaper, and we never see him again after this. It's like the show totally forgot about him, then needed another false suspect for its whodunnit episode, and then promptly forgot all about him again. The show treats him exactly like Lionel does. In the paraphrased words of Norman Osborn, it does what it needs to with him, then brooms him fast. Ah, well, I'd imagine Lionel only hired him because his accent makes him sound cultured. And we all know how cultured Lionel is. He reads books that spell out his worldview in the title and goes to operas critics say aren't very musically sophisticated. But Jonathan is the police's only suspect because, as we discover at the end in a less than brilliant reveal, the sheriff framed him after finding out Jonathan threatened Lionel from someone in Lionel's office looking to file a restraining order, and he's setting up Jonathan for the fall of his own attempt on Lionel's life. Clark knows his dad's not a murderer, so he starts snooping around, piecing the whole plot together thanks mostly to his X-ray vision and his physical resilience. After Lionel's pet monkey Dominic starts raising suspicions about Lex, Clark begins to think maybe his supposed best friend is capable of shooting his own dad and framing his, and the two of them have what Chloe would call a massive blowout in Lex's office. Odd that Clark doesn't call back to any other of Lex's morally ambiguous escapades past the time Lex shot Roger Nixon, which he did, to save Clark's father, as proof that Lex could be capable of this. But I chalk that up to poor dialogue writing over poor characterization. At least, I assume that scene in Vortex is what he's referring to when he says, "It's not like I haven't seen you shoot someone before," and not the time Lex was shooting at him when he was under the influence of crypto-hypnotism in Hug. So eventually the evidence starts to point way away from Lex and toward Ethan, and I'm fuzzy on whether or not Clark suspected, man, it is hard not to use that word everywhere myself right now, Ethan himself, until he sees a conveniently posted photo of the bartender and Ethan above the freezer at the Wild Coyote. Turns out the bartender was in on the whole thing because Ethan paid him off as Clark suspected, word choice, all along, and he's absolutely positive when he sees that picture that the sheriff is the culprit, just because he, Jonathan, and the bartender were all friends going back to high school, and Ethan looked the other way when the bar sold to minors. I don't know, it's not exactly a smoking gun. And one big thing Clark is missing that the other three potential culprits all have is motive. But it hardly matters, because Clark's plan to entrap Ethan and catch him red-handed really doesn't rely on knowing who the culprit is at all. Just put out some sort of message that Lionel is doing okay, maybe he called the police, I don't know, he doesn't say, and hope the villain appears to finish the job, which Clark's positive he'll do more because the episode's almost over than anything. He could have done that half an episode earlier, but then we'd have, just half an episode. Oh, and we finally learned why Henry Small stopped practicing as a trial lawyer. Someone he represented his court-appointed defense turned out to be guilty, but he lost the case and the guy was executed before that information came to light. He doesn't want to represent Jonathan because of it, but Lana convinces him to, and just when he's almost integral to more than a what the heck do we do with Lana side story, Clark proves who the real attempted murderer is, and he's relegated back to Dominic Santori status. So after he's found out by Clark, a man who tried to murder high school kids breaks down and blubbers like a baby. Lex and Clark make up, and Lionel explains to Lex how he turned a good man into a killer, blaming Lex for the whole thing. Lex gets that disparaging look of, I'm turning into a supervillain and I know it again, then credits. The standout character here is Jonathan Kent, and I really like his having to face the consequences of his temper head-on, as opposed to last episode where his emotions getting the better of him in how he reacted to Lionel making Martha work on their anniversary might have horribly affected his wife, but in reality had no bearing at all on those events. If Jonathan wasn't so headstrong and publicly brazen about how he feels about the Luthors, Ethan wouldn't have been able to pin Lionel shooting on him. It's not directly his fault that he's in jail, of course. As he says to Martha in a wonderfully tender moment, I didn't shoot Lionel, but I let my anger get the best of me. But when you don't keep your emotions in check, you become vulnerable to psychological predators, people who can take advantage of you and use those weaknesses against you, just as Lionel does. And that's the kind of person Lionel's turned Ethan into, even if I don't quite buy that. Jonathan is realizing he has to find a midpoint between the cold, emotionless, calculating attitude Lionel Luthor has and wearing his heart so obviously on his sleeve it's easy for anyone to take a stab at it. Lionel takes people in emotionally compromised moments, gives them seemingly impossible choices, and then when they come back at him for it, points out that they had a choice all along, which he does when he mentions Clark's adoption and that Jonathan has as much to do with getting a foothold on the community as Lionel did. That doesn't make Lionel any less of a monster, but I love that we're consistently holding Jonathan accountable for his own actions. He did make a mistake giving in to Lionel with the adoption, and he made a mistake again giving in to his jealousy. The only way to fight a viper like that is to make the hard choice that might mean personal sacrifice. You have to prove the old adage wrong that every man has his price. The big theme of this episode, and it builds on the Luthor versus Kent thread woven throughout the season, is articulated by Jonathan in the same scene, where he tells Martha that all it takes is one bad decision to ruin everything. A lot of our characters this episode are facing that and handle it in different ways. Jonathan is going through a period of acceptance that he has that problem, and he hasn't really done anything to change it yet, other than to pledge he's going to. On the opposite side of the spectrum, you have Lex. He keeps letting his hatred for his father and his obsession with getting out from under his thumb turn him into his father, and the more he makes the same mistakes, the more he feels like it's pointless to try to be the better man. At this point in the series, he's still not at the point of no return, but when his father tells him, much like what he said to Jonathan earlier about Clark's adoption, that everything that's happened here is Lex's fault because he defied Lionel, and that forced Lionel to take drastic measures to buy out his board member shares, which included holding leverage over the sheriff, which led to the sheriff making his one bad decision, Lex isn't doing what Jonathan is doing. He's letting it sink in and allowing himself to believe more and more that he must do what Ethan did, become the devil to fight the devil. Lex, I'm going to give you a homework assignment. Write 5 pages on where you see yourself in 5 years. Clark is facing his own temper, which he's inherited from his father. There's potentially an interesting nature versus nurture question we might explore when we get to Jor-El later on, when he's pushed to the edge, a little like what he goes through in Rogue with Sam Phelan. This is a problem he can't solve by sprinkling a little bullet time and convenient unconsciousness on it, although, also like in that episode, superpowers certainly come in handy once he forces himself to remain level-headed and use them intelligently. He's positive the bartender is involved in the frame job, and Clark would love to kill that guy for what he's doing to his dad. But obviously that accomplishes nothing and proves that everyone has it in themselves to be manipulated by a viper like Lionel to the point of personal ruin. He also expects the worst from Lex and jumps to conclusions, though maybe not quite as far as he thinks when it turns out Lex is innocent. and he's acting just like his father was when he got himself into this situation. Lex has a history of putting his own interests in front of his friends, which he did just last episode, and I wish Clark had brought that up, because he would have seemed a great deal more vindicated in that moment for acting this way. And yet, there's a fine line between healthy suspicion and rampant paranoia, and Clark is certainly getting close to the side that Jonathan crossed when he smashed Martha's watch and created the motive that made him the prime suspect. So following his father's recently rocky example and dealing with a friend who, no matter how altruistic he is, he'd be an idiot to completely trust, Clark is learning but still finding himself, and of course that's what this whole show is supposed to be about. Then we've got the optimistic silver lining in Henry Small, whose bad decision happened years ago, and he's finally doing the right thing, despite how hard it is, by going to an innocent man's defense and really trying to serve justice now after his apathy led to another innocent man's execution. Again, he doesn't get to totally play that out, but agreeing to do it is enough to resolve his mini character arc, and in playing out the point I think this episode is trying to make, that we always have a choice to embrace our dark side or resist it and learn from it, which I really appreciate, because that's what Superman is all about. We need that triumphant example here of the man who does a terrible thing, but ultimately redeems himself. There's a decent mysterious atmosphere to this episode, and I like that it immediately follows Insurgents. We're getting far away from the standard Kryptofreak formula and trying different kinds of stories on this stage, first a corporate espionage story and now a sort of murder mystery. Some of the imagery is silly and cliche and borders on unintentional parody, like the noirish shadow of Ethan holding the gun when he walks into the hospital room, but I really like the moodiness of that opening scene. Nobody gets shot with more style and panache than Lionel Luthor, man, and nobody shoots with more presence and intensity than Lex, even if it's just somebody's conjectured version of events and an excuse just to get to see that image. There's not a lot of continuity that's directly contradicted this episode, but it's really awkward that we end last episode with Jonathan saying he wants to take a page out of Lionel's playbook, and then we open this episode with Martha no longer being in his employ and Jonathan telling Lionel to stay away from her. It works. He didn't know about the watch when he made that plan. But as I said, I think seeing the Kents slowly turning into the Luthors and realizing it just before they go too far would have been far more interesting than having Jonathan sort of come to that revelation all at once, and there's going to be a little bit of regrouping and trying to figure out how Clark's family really fits into the equation now that we've cut off that direct link that had the families intertwined at the parental level, as well as the Lex and Clark friendship. Also weird on a first viewing, because I'm yelling at the screen thinking it's inconsistent until way too far into the episode when I realize it sort of knows what it's doing. This has not been a smart enough show overall for me to trust that it won't totally ignore a status quo established in one episode in favor of a new one. A lot of that could have been avoided if this really was a cliffhanger, where the end of last episode saw Lionel getting shot. Immediately everything's shaken up, and so we wouldn't be so jarred by this new direction that's so contrary from what was established from the Kents at the end of last episode, and it would be a truer homage to Who Shot JR, which I'm sure it's intentionally aping, given that that's also about an awful human being that everyone and his dog would have reason to want dead. On the other hand, Martha working for Lionel never sat well with me, so a part of me likes getting past that, but I wish Martha had a wake-up call like Jonathan's that makes her realize the gravity of her own mistakes. Yeah, she got taken hostage with Lionel last episode and saw his true colors, and yeah, she was ready to quit, but she never comes right out and says, I knew what kind of person he was all along, and I ignored that because of my own ambition. That's made especially problematic when Lionel actually mentions, and as far as I'm aware, this is the only time it comes up, that he and Martha discussed what happened with Clark's adoption, and according to him, Martha just said she was afraid he wouldn't let her live her life. Now, considering the source, he's probably twisting whatever she really said, but we're making this too much about Jonathan's mistakes. What he helped Lionel do to the community was at least for the sake of his family. That doesn't make it right, but what Martha did was all about her and her alone, and I think that should be addressed far more than it is here. It's also really awkward that the conversation Lana had with Henry Small's wife isn't addressed at all here, and I think that is pretty inconsistent. Last episode made a pretty big deal out of this character flaw Lana wasn't aware of with Henry, that he loses interest in things and, according to his wife, is definitely going to hurt Lana. Here, she acts like she thought she totally understood him and could trust him, and is totally appalled when he won't take Jonathan's case. I half expected him to never show up again after last episode, and wondered if that conversation with Small's wife was how he was being written out of the show. Now I'm not sure if Lana is ignoring that development, because she certainly didn't look like she would last episode, or if the show is just pretending that didn't happen, or if we're trying to draw a complex, multifaceted person and it'll be addressed later. This episode is reveling in the novelty of doing a whodunit story, and even for primetime TV, it's a pretty shoddy one. I like some of the character stuff it's doing with the situation, but the situation itself is pretty absurd. The idea that Lionel could take a good man like Ethan and turn him into a killer is great, but he goes so far beyond one mistake, it's ridiculous. I get the point of it. Like Lex on Fast Forward, he's covering up mistakes with worse mistakes and spiraling down into the dark abyss. The problem is that I buy Lex as someone who's capable of the terrible things he'll eventually do and the morally ambiguous stuff he's done already. But Ethan doesn't strike me as someone who would have the constitution to A, frame his friend, B, murder another friend, and C, try to kill teenagers. He comes off like a complete plot device and almost an afterthought. We're writing a mystery plot, we need somebody no one will suspect. It's the sheriff! On paper, it's a good idea. Because this town has become so corrupted, I could see Lionel doing this to him over time, but he's only dealt directly with Lionel once, and yes, he talks about how sick he is of seeing what's happened to the town, and he can't stand the idea that Lionel finally has leverage on him after all these years when he thought he had the resources finally to fight Lionel and be the one guy in Smallville who could make a single phone call and end his reign of terror. But the trouble is, it's really vague about what made Ethan finally resort to going to Lionel for money in the first place, which is his motivation in helping Lionel get to Lex's board of directors. He says he was strapped, and that's all we get. We need to know something about his home life or his money problems, and maybe I'd buy it more if Lionel had more directly affected him in the past, like he had Jonathan. A lot of the details in the mystery plot are really silly. Clark thinks the reason Jonathan is knocked out in his truck after he went to the bar is that someone drugged him, and that's exactly what turns out to have happened. So why isn't Clark questioning the blood alcohol test? Ethan says Jonathan was at 2.0 and had to have been lying about only having one drink. That could have been Clark's tip-off that something's fishy with the sheriff. Unless there's a drug that makes it appear someone's really drunk, Ethan would have to be lying, because he says he administered the test himself. And why is Ethan using such conspicuous methods to cover his tracks? He trusted his bartender accomplice not to say anything about the murder in the first place, but right after Clark and Pete go snooping there, Ethan kills him. They didn't find out anything. The bartender stuck to his story, and they have no evidence. All Ethan is doing is corroborating Clark's suspicions, and I suspect, there's that word again, it's just lazy writing, so Clark can do detective stuff and save the day, and so we can get some action in this exposition-heavy episode. Explosions don't make everything better, especially in a story where the stakes we care most about are the family ones. And really, Ethan got in an 18-wheeler and blew up the car Clark and Pete were driving in because they were barking up the right tree? Again, they don't really have much to go on right now but a hunch. I would assume Ethan knew they were there because the bartender called him, but how did he wind up in a big rig with a rifle driving at them? I suppose that probably wasn't actually Ethan, and maybe he made a quick call to the local small-town assassin. I mean, that's never explained, and I suppose it might make some sort of sense, but it's unintentionally hilarious to me. I don't think we've had an episode yet that includes the episode title as often in dialogue as this one does. Lionel uses it in a different context, but no doubt writers Mark Verheiden and or Philip Levins did it intentionally and think it's super clever. In the first minute and a half, when Lionel says he suspects Martha Kent is no longer in his employ. And since the gimmicky framework this episode is seeing several possible shooting scenarios with each of the 4 potential suspects, maybe the title should have been pluralized? Suspects? Anyway, and questions to ask Jarrell when I get to heaven. When Clark uses his X-ray vision, what exactly is the sound effect? And this is in other Superman things as well. Same thing with the kryptonite sound. But I'm going to ask Jarrell when I get to heaven because, I don't know, maybe he'll know. Toward the end, Clark X-rays the icebox, and we don't see the special effect because the scene thinks it'll be more dramatic if we see the body along with Pete, I guess. Since we're not in first-person POV there, we don't hear the sound effect. So it got me thinking, obviously nobody else is hearing that sound when we hear it, or they'd ask Clark why the heck he sounds like a weird camera going off every time he squints his eyes. But is that sound just for the audience's benefit? Or does Clark actually hear it, like, in his head? Does it make his ears ring for minutes afterwards? What is is it? Well, I've got very little to count this week, which kind of breaks my theory that a short count means a great episode. This isn't a horrible episode, certainly, but it's not nearly as good as other episodes where we only get to hear the first few seconds of the pinball number count. I'm going to have to go back and count any earlier ones. I think there's at least one or two, and feel free to help me in the comments, but I want to start counting Luthor's getting shot, because it happens quite a bit. So we've got one of those here, even though we see it happen over and over again, like the Enterprise exploding and cause and effect. I'm also starting a new count I may need to retroactively add to, and that's Lex throwing people out of his office. Kind of the reverse of walking away angry. I'm also interested to see just how many times it's Clark when it's all said and done. We've got one instance of Clark's parents being attacked or kidnapped, not in the conventional way, but what Ethan does to Jonathan is certainly a sort of attack. We have one of the wildest and most over-the-top car crashes ever, when Pete's car gets run off the road, flies through the air, and gets blown up by an expert shot from a rifle and a gas pipe. Whoever that guy was, he's a pro. Okay, I've decided there's no way that could have been Ethan. That guy couldn't make sure an unarmed man was dead from point-blank range. I'm going to give Suspect a 2.5 out of 4. I think I like it more than I did before I started writing about it, as all those parallels of people coping with or exacerbating a mistake they didn't think they were capable of came together, but there's some really clunky writing here, both in plotting and in dialogue. If there's anything I missed in any category, please leave me a personal message on Geekvolution, and I'll be sure to add it to the count. I'm Captain Logan, and consider this episode counted.